Hi, I like FromSoft a lot, and to sort of build my credibility, I'd like to just open with, I've beaten every FromSoft game from the PS3 Demon's Souls up to Elden Ring multiple times. I've platinumed Bloodborne. I've also platinumed Sekiro and Elden Ring on both PS5 and PC. So, twice. Point is, I'm very familiar with the Souls formula, and something that you realize as you play more and more FromSoft games is the way that ideas are toyed with and adapted over time. Sometimes lifted directly, like the Demon's Souls Dreglings animations, how they appear in nearly every game since, and sometimes more nuanced, like how healing works, or the Black Phantoms, or other more specific mechanics. It allows FromSoft to be economical, while also experimenting more and not sacrificing the quality or length of their games like other studios might have to otherwise, and take much longer between releases. My argument is simple. Sekiro does it best. Sekiro is perfectly balanced. So let's just take a skip and jog through all the wonderful worlds that FromSoft has had to offer and look at all of these different mechanics and how they're balanced. Something really cool about Sekiro, while being the most different of the recent FromSoft titles, sometimes having people doubt or debate as to whether it even counts as a quote-unquote Souls-like, while this difference being apparent, it actually balances the ideas of the games before it and integrates their concepts the most. Let's start with healing. Demon's Souls healing used grass. Different types heal different amounts and must be collected manually, either from shops or enemies as drops. The grass is finite, but can be consumed as many times as the grass that you have. The balancing issue here is, other than being unneededly complex for inventory management, it also fundamentally rewards grinding, not skill. If you have enough time on your hands, you can grind grass and heal tons in a single boss fight, basically breaking the balancing. But on the downside, once you're out, you will likely have to grind earlier levels that are easy or sell souls to get more. Since theoretically you could have any number of grass, the difficulty of Demon's Souls bosses is fairly detached from the combination of player skill, progression, and level. And I know that difficulty isn't typically an aim or focus of the original Demon's Souls more than novelty was, but it still bears mentioning. Dark Souls 1 threw out grass in favor of the famous, iconic, and in my opinion much better Estus. 5 to start with, and you can upgrade individual bonfires or breakpoints to have 10 Estus when you rest at them, with at least initially limited resources of humanity. After defeating a specific boss, you can also unlock the ability to spend more humanity at select bonfires to raise the cap up to 20. The strength of Estus was also tied largely to set events within the progress of the game, so as you gradually got stronger heals, the game adjusted more towards that, creating a generally adaptive but connected difficulty, where smarter or veteran players could get a leg up with lesser-known paths, and heals were still finite. The fact that each individual bonfire needed to be leveled up too created a balance between choosing which challenges are worth upgrading the fires for, and which are worth pushing through to the end and keeping the spare resources. Humanity could also drop on the player automatically after killing a certain amount of enemies, essentially giving free humanity at the cost of use it or lose it. Then, of course, to upgrade fires if online, you will need to be human, which would open you up to the chance of player attacks as well. This system generally doesn't have any downsides for how I see it. There is a comfortable amount of situational difficulty selection, with the game still rounding around the expected stats of the player. Sure, 20 Estus with upgraded heals is debatably as broken as the unlimited grass, and is an issue for balancing, but rather than grinding for the advantage, it was considerably more convoluted, and not something that you were likely to ever possibly do without prior knowledge of the game and its secrets. Dark Souls 2 attempts to mend a middle ground in the balancing between Demon's Souls Grass and Dark Souls 1's Estus. Estus is reduced from 5 now, and is instead constant across fires at a limited number of flasks. To get more Estus, you will need to explore more of the world and find individual Estus shards. which both rewards exploration and more closely allows the game to balance its difficulty around specific Estus amounts, getting rid of some of the difficulty flexibility, but in turn offering greater and more consistent difficulty balance for the players. The game also infamously features healing gems, which can be used while walking slowly in rapid succession with a slow healing stack effect. There are a few variants as well, but the variety is largely squashed, especially if you look back at Demon's Souls. This is of course better for inventory efficiency from Demon's Souls, but gems are still, like grass, essentially limitless if one chooses to grind, and especially after the first couple bosses or so, healing items can be cheaply purchased infinitely until you fill your stack, at a price that is fairly reasonable and only gets more so for the rest of the game. This makes it so, while the Estus may better center around player difficulty, the gems break the connection of player skill, level, and progress almost entirely. Very much a one step forward, two steps back type of solution that contains genuine improvements for those searching for a true difficulty balance, but largely undermines those said improvements. Well, if the main issue is in limited heals, but limited Estus tied to progress seems to be an improvement, what can you imagine Dark Souls 3 does? Well, it scraps the gems, and the previous incarnation, grass, and instead keeps Dark Souls 2's approach to Estus with a new slight caveat. Now, someone can choose to trade individual Estus vials they already have for magic restoring vials if they would like, adding a different kind of player balance to the healing system. You trade the amount of heals you have, the amount of errors in battle you're allowed to make, for more plentiful and powerful attacks. But they are both tied to the same core resource that can't be replenished unless you're at a bonfire. They are just split how the player thinks fits their playstyle the best. This resource can be adjusted either way at any time, and otherwise features the same boost levels of each restoration based on progress of unique items that Dark Souls 1 introduced and that Dark Souls 2 carried on. Dark Souls 1 being Firekeeper Souls, and Dark Souls 2 being Sublime Bone Dust. So Dark Souls 3 seems to have logically iterated to balance toward difficulty management the best here. The only thing is that, for many players who don't use magic, this extra balancing decision will almost go entirely unused in many playthroughs, if ever used at all. So, while offering the greatest connection of player skill, progress, and level difficulty with its healing, it also offers the least player customizability and choice, the least strategy in inventory management. Bloodborne takes a sharp departure in another direction, throwing Estus out in favor of limited blood vials. In Bloodborne, you have a max capacity 20 blood vials, which are finite and obtained by farming enemies. Essentially, this is grass or gems, with a few adjustments to increase the balancing. First, there is one central type of healing blood vial in your quick slot in the game. This flattens from the 6 grass types to 3 gem types to now 1, even though the standard life gem normally does the job fine. The other notable change here is that nearly every enemy can drop blood vials, and that you can purchase them for a price that adjusts based on your progress in the game. This means minimal grinding, and if you run out, you can almost always see it as a sort of tax on your blood echoes to get more, a way of punishing the player for running out and being reckless. As aforementioned, you are limited to 20 vials at one time, meaning you can't hoard and overwhelm a boss with sheer healing ability. This means the entire game is based around the assumption that 20 vials could be used at any time. The thing is though, while similarly well balanced in regards to quality as Dark Souls 3, it suffers a similar issue. That is, there is very little strategy with how healing is used, and oftentimes 20 vials is far more than would be needed for a boss fight. The way that stats are balanced in battle and the damage outputs of enemies as well are 2 to 3 hits to kill the player at full health for a majority of players casually running through the game, meaning the amount of healing won't matter if a single combo can take you out from full health. This is, of course, somewhat balanced by one of Bloodborne's highly regarded features, the ability to hit enemies after taking damage to steal some of your health back without needing to heal. This is the driving force behind Bloodborne's more aggressive gameplay loop, and does a good bit in softening the inability to reliably get heals in as often as most fights and other Souls games. Finally though, while a positive in reducing mindless grinding, the sheer amount of blood vials one will get erases a large part of the reason that a game would choose to have such a finite resource. With something like grass, you hesitate to spam because if you run out, then it'll take a while to get more. You are actively aware of the limit that you have. But with blood vials, unless you are a blood vial fiend, or very early in the game, you are likely to get many, many more than you ever would need, and at some point rarely probably consider the finite nature of blood vials in your playthrough. If you do run out, it is likely to be a minor inconvenience, or to actively be a time waster, punishing you by wasting your time rather than making you face more challenges. It feels like a band-aid approach to balancing in regards to player choice and strategy, an illusion of choice for essentially the same exact balancing as Dark Souls 3. You can also sacrifice health for items like bullets, which are also finite, so some loose connection could be made to the magic Estus in Dark Souls 3 and the blood vial to healing bullet creation through damage, but the finite nature is much more arbitrary. Still, Bloodborne offers far closer difficulty balancing to the player's healing ability than Demon Souls, Dark Souls 1, and Dark Souls 2. So, how does Sekiro balance healing? Sekiro also chooses to adapt the progress-based Estus introduced in Dark Souls 2 and carried on to Dark Souls 3, and in Elden Ring after Sekiro as well, having the amount of healing that you have be based on exploration and player progress. You will find gourd seeds from vendors, bosses, and in less explored areas, as well as along major progression paths, meaning the game has a strong tie between its difficulty balancing and the amount of healing a prospective player will possess. However, this lack of freedom in variety is somewhat circumvented more greatly, as before the Genichiro fight, the second major boss fight of the game, you have an opportunity to explore further, and if you explore smartly, you can get up to 6 gourd seeds before the fight. This keeps with the adaptive difficulty of Souls games in large, where even though the average player is likely to have 2 or 3 healing gourds at this point, for those struggling against the boss, they have alternative options that can make the fight easier available to them. Not only that, but the available options are based on exploration, skill, and new adventures rather than grinding. Notably though, while this increased healing increases their amount of mistakes allowable, it does not undercut the fundamental mechanics of the fight. They can't simply grind until they do enough damage. They are already always doing the intended amount of damage. They simply need to improve their skill and are given options to increase their room for error. Another thing that is brought back is finite and slow healing in the form of pellets. You can have a max of 3 in your active inventory, which keeps the problem of rapid consumption to tank foes, and also is less immediately effective than gourds. This gives players more freedom and healing options for strategy, while not fundamentally changing the flow of the fight or overpowering the foe like you would see often and easily in Dark Souls 2. This inventory management is also much better than Demon Souls, as once again, it's flattened down to 1 healing type, like Bloodborne, but unlike Bloodborne, is not so abundant and necessary that one would use them frivolously. They are mostly an act of a last resort of healing, or as a way to counteract slow damage of fire or poison. Another thing, like the Bone Dust and Firekeeper souls of yore, are heal strength upgrades, obtained mostly as a means of progressing skill trees or beating mini-bosses. These will increase the effectiveness of your healing items. The ranking typically corresponds with a certain level of progress you are in the game, but if once again you are struggling with a boss, you can strategically choose to focus on pursuing those healing upgrades sooner than otherwise would naturally occur. Of course, getting the extra healing strength earlier balances with getting less of other skills and abilities, the healing balanced around the progress of the game, while also offering greater player variety. While in Dark Souls 1, you sometimes had trade-offs with healing upgrades like killing the Anorlando Firekeeper for her soul in exchange for access to that bonfire, but largely things like Bone Dust are a matter of, I got this thing and now I use it. Sekiro's solution is more consistently dynamic and offers players a greater way to use this small feature to greater shape their own playthrough without breaking the systems in place that reserve difficulty, giving the player more freedom without detaching them from the difficulty arc. This healing system then, I think, most balances the player's skill and progress with the current enemies being faced, while also rewarding exploration the most and offering the most strategic variety than any game before it. As a final addendum, I would like to note things like divine healing also exist in limited form in most FromSoft games, but are so rare to gameplay and not significantly different between games that I don't think they significantly play into any argument for any game being better balanced than another for these games in particular. But let's move on from healing. Sekiro also deals with level progression itself and as a whole in a much different way that I think balances more around optimizing choice while limiting the ability to break from the difficulty balancing. Now, for me personally, what I value the most about these FromSoft games and their gameplay loop is the fact that it offers a fair challenge that I can overcome. Knowing that I overcame something from outsmarting something, or by figuring it out, or by getting better, is always more satisfying instead of grinding until I have the stats to beat it. Now, I like just spending time farming enemies as well, and getting items to level up quite a bit in FromSoft games. It's good to turn my brain off. It's very relaxing, putting on a video game, repeatedly taking out the same enemies. But while this gameplay loop is something I find satisfying, and a certain amount of enemies need to be defeated in an average first-time playthrough. In order to have the strength to progress, you may find yourself underleveled at times and need to go back and get a level where you feel more comfortable with the challenge. For the most part, I think this balancing is done really well and almost seems unavoidable across FromSoft games. But the give and take essentially comes to trading difficulty with real-world time. You're trading the amount of skill someone needs to get better and progress in the game with the amount of time they're willing to invest, which I don't exactly think is a positive gameplay loop. Nearly any struggle can be drastically trivialized if one only is willing to spend enough time leveling up in most of these games. Dark Souls has a fairly even distribution for bosses relative to the player in my experience, with perhaps a slight bump before Ornstein and Smaug. That is, assuming you haven't discovered the Painted World. Dark Souls 2 offers so many possible routes and bosses that I honestly never found myself needing to grind either past the earlier portion of the game where I was investing stats to use a weapon that I wanted. Bloodborne has the most drastic of jump in level difficulty, with the jump in difficulty between Shadows of Yharnam and Rom the Spider being perhaps the most immediate jump in stat requirement in a Souls game. To not instantly be one-shot, I have to level up 20, maybe 30 times over what was a comfortable level for the previous main boss fight, which is literally a small walk forward. Which is egregious, especially as, unlike, say, Dark Souls 2, there are very few alternate optional bosses and content to engage with at that point to alleviate the imbalance, aside from grinding. Ideally, if the aim is to maximize both player freedom and a connection of the player's strength mechanically to the foes that they are facing, the straightforward leveling system, while classic and enjoyable, is fundamentally not fit to serve that goal. If you exponentially raise the price for leveling, you end up soft-locking most players into a particular level as the game progresses, giving the illusion of leveling up while in all reality being railroaded to the level gap that the game wants you at. If you don't exponentially increase the level rate and allow easy leveling up, you trivialize the hard work and balancing done in the levels for the game's enemies and bosses, allowing players to easily bypass much of the core game's intended experience. Largely, it seems, the more true choice a player has, the less possibility for balance. The more balance a player faces, the less opportunity for true creativity, outside of build variety, which we can discuss later on. So, the solution Sekiro creates is not a progression based on the arbitrary value of each defeated foe, but a progression based on the completion of specific optional challenges, or mini-bosses. To increase one's stats in Sekiro, their max health, their posture, you must obtain 4 beads and use them to upgrade by turning them into a single prayer necklace. These beads become individual measures of great achievement and exploration, meaning every time you increase in health in Sekiro, it is due to a significant conquered challenge rather than just an increased amount of time spent killing the same enemies for the player. It progresses largely the same that the healing system does in Dark Souls 2 and 3, but with the heavier emphasis on individual combat achievements. Some select beads are sold, or kept as rewards for exploration, as to offer some player variety and balancing for those who maybe enjoy playing and exploring but aren't as good at combat. But largely they are kept to these mini-bosses, which again appear in select areas and times, making it so that the player has broad freedom to take on these challenges before or after different major bosses, and select which they find easier to make their own individual journey unique and suited to their playstyle. This is largely because major bosses give memories, which serve as flat damage upgrades, so there is some consideration for players to think about on their own strengths and weaknesses and ask what is more obtainable for them in a select moment. More prayer beads now might get the memory easier, or get the memory so the prayer beads are easier. It's a dynamic choice that gives genuine opportunity for the player to change their playthroughs, while also balancing the range of difficulty to the current potential progress of the player. Notable as well that a full 4 prayer beads for a single upgrade are available before the Genichiro fight that require no fighting, which again helps those who may be struggling in the beginning of the game if they only are willing to engage with the game they're given, have fun, and explore. Another thing that is split is that while stat upgrades are gated by achievements, both major and minor, necessary and optional, skill upgrades still rely on an XP system where the points are rewarded for killing enemies and bosses, and there is a chance of losing half of said XP of the current level upon death. This is to say, there is a separate bar that fills up on its own. Each level is essentially a skill point that can be used to purchase more dynamic moveset upgrades. Some of these are more crucial to most players, like the Mikiri counter, which allows for countering thrust attacks easily with another button press, aside from dodging or perfect parrying through each of them. Some are more specific playstyle attacks. Some are healing strength upgrades, like I mentioned prior. Some are increased usability, like mid-air prosthetics or deflection, and some are minor buffs to use things like posture, defense, damage, and so on. Again, these upgrades are largely broadening the skill pool for play options at the player's disposal in a fight, rather than more general stat boosts that flatten the difficulty if grinded. So even if a person were to grind in Sekiro, they would simply have more tools at their disposal in a fight, many of which require their own skill and timing and understanding to perform effectively. They are their own moves to be mastered from a player's perspective, rather than straightforwardly throwing a bigger fireball in the direction. Money as well, which you will gain from items and killing foes, can rarely be used to buy greater upgrades like prayer beads, but more often buy things like temporary poison cures or pellets, which are used for the hypothetical 3 extra healing in a hypothetical fight. They also are used to fund optional upgrades to the prosthetics. The whole game is built to maximize the options while maintaining balance and difficulty. So, let's talk about options. As the Fashion Souls and Single Sword are often criticized as the game focusing or perhaps forcing the player into a one playstyle, where other Souls games let you have a huge number of weapons, a lot of the time this idea is levied at face value, that Sekiro offers one type of game, and I can see why intuitively this seems true. But I think it's important to distinguish variety in all important and mechanically significant ways here. In a Souls game, you normally start with a standard weapon, then maybe down the line you get one you like, and eventually you settle into one that you really like. From there, you use limited resources to upgrade this weapon to its max strength. This is usually done with 1 or at max maybe 2 weapons per playthrough, because the game heavily limits the availability of upgrades to plus 10 or plus 15. Oftentimes, these items are limited as late game rewards or very rare grinding drops. One good example is Bloodborne, which has one blood rock in the main game at the end of the Nightmare of Mensis, right before the second to last, or depending on your ending, the last boss of the main game, meaning you won't be able to fully upgrade a single weapon until that point. Another blood rock is also, of course, available at the fishing hamlet in the DLC, the final area of the DLC before the DLC's final boss as well. If the player wants more than just the standard one in the main game through a single playthrough, they will have to traverse nearly all of the major chalice dungeons and go to areas far above the recommended level for even the end of the game for a first playthrough, essentially marking them as New Game Plus territory or extreme insanity grinding materials to obtain. Nothing that would serve a practical purpose, because if you could get far enough to obtain blood rocks in the chalice dungeons, you are far over-leveled for any possible bosses that you would be fighting to beat the primary campaign. Point is, most players going through a single playthrough of a Souls game will find one weapon they like, stick to it, upgrade it. Aside from Dark Souls 2, it is not easy to double up and use multiple weapons, although Bloodborne does feature 2 forms for all of its weapons, which is super cool. The primary difference between all of these weapons on a mechanical level come down to 3 things though: frame variety, hitbox, and type of damage. One damage type might thrust, which does better against armor. One might be blunt damage, which can stun or flatten foes. One might be more of a slash. Different games have different stat differences against different foes in minor ways, the most notable being ones with unique enemy animations, like for when the Kirkhammer in Bloodborne flattens some enemies. Aside from these minor quirks, though, that come with some weapons, it's all stat differences, hitboxes, and whatever feels intuitive in regards to the frame data to the player. It might seem odd, since I like Sekiro, which has the fastest gameplay of a FromSoft game, but I actually enjoy the slow, methodical approach many times using a big, heavy weapon in other Souls games. I like having the large hitbox, having to prepare much farther in advance when I want to choose to strike, but it feels more strategic and intuitive to me. I like to hit less times, but do more damage. Some people are the opposite though, and the preference is really where the play variety of most Souls games comes into things. In terms of a single playthrough for a single player though, and what the gameplay variety they're experiencing is, it pans out like this: light attack animation, heavy attack animation, parry, block, roll. If you are playing Bloodborne, the block is removed, and instead dodging typically becomes dashing unless you are locked off. This comes down to a central moveset of 5 options, or 6 in Bloodborne if you're substituting the one block with an alternate weapon form that also has its own light and heavy attacks. In Sekiro, there are levels of success based on button press accuracy, meaning based on your timing you can either block or parry. Holding the block ensures no parries and takes minor posture damage, while parrying deflects an attack, and if timed perfectly will prevent the posture from breaking regardless of how full a bar is, and even block red kanji thrusting attacks from foes. You have a dash, a thrust counter, a light attack, a thrust, a jump, and a jumping posture attack. A standard increase of 8 total options for the most basic combat scenario in any situation in Sekiro, at least assuming you don't ignore the Mikiri counter, which is very easily available to you from the beginning. This is of course just on the basic level. The thrust in Sekiro takes a moment longer, meaning there are fairly direct parallels to the light, heavy, block, parry, with the dash not being used for iframes but more for battle placement, and the additional jumping and jumping posture attacks, as well as the separately button-mapped counter being unique to the casual gameplay loop. There is something I am leaving out for both Souls and Sekiro, though, that adds a lot more variety, although they do operate fairly differently. Demon Souls and the Dark Souls trilogy that followed all contain a magic system which operates somewhat as a secondary weapon with their own stat requirements for leveling and damage output that often overlap or are largely separate from the stats that you would use for most melee weapons. While a person will have to ration their levels to make certain types of spells effective enough for the late game, most players will not even have a fraction of the skills available at once, but still, there are 28 sorceries in Dark Souls, with 11 being upgrades of stronger versions of other sorceries with other little differences otherwise, and 8 being largely outside combat, like the repair spell, light spell, fall damage resistance spells, meaning there are roughly 9 different unique sorceries in Dark Souls 1 for combat variety purposes. Pyromancy does not work the same as the other sorceries, but also has many spells available to the player, with 20 spells, with 8 being stronger variants of previous ones, coming out to roughly 12 pyromancies. This is actually a great variety of movesets, and while the spell slots and levels may only allow 2 or 3 mainstay spells, you at least have multiple pools to combine with. Demon Souls contains 22 spells, as pyromancy and sorcery are not meaningfully separated as they are in Dark Souls 1, and there are also more substantial differences from spell to spell, but they have some practical overlap like Poison Cloud and Plague Cloud and Soul Arrow versus Soul Ray. Dark Souls 2 has 31 sorceries, 13 being stronger variants, with few meaningful differences aside from hitboxes and damage, many having similar use overlap like the Soul Greatsword and the Great Magic Weapon, and 7 spells that are non-combat oriented with an exception for some in PvP, meaning 11 unique sorceries with some use overlap in functionality. Dark Souls 2 also has the categories of pyromancy, hexes, and miracles as their own significant variant types. There are 21 pyromancies, 9 of which are variants, making roughly 12 unique kinds of pyromancy. There are 28 miracles in Dark Souls 2. 12 are variants, 16 are unique spells, and 3 are non-combat oriented, giving 13 unique spells. There are 23 hexes in Dark Souls 2, 3 variants, 6 are similar to other types of sorceries by my count, pyromancies or miracles, let's just say 11, 12, 13, and 15, for a total of roughly 51 options. Although, again, for proper equipment and stat preparation, only 3 of these would actually apply to a single playthrough. Almost done. Dark Souls 3, there are 39 miracles. You know what? I hope that you just get the point by now. I thought that putting all these numbers here would be funny or fun to hear and all, but it's starting to bore me to death. 30 pyromancies, 38 sorceries, 4 Ash DLC spells, 6 Ring City DLC spells, with similar ratios as the previous examples that I already went through. Bloodborne does not have magic, but has an analogous function in the Hunter's tools, of which there are 12. These are balanced significantly better because they can be integrated into any player's moveset fairly easily, but are limited by bullet resource, or the number of parries a player can do in a run. They are all different enough that I would count them all as separately more useful than each other in the right circumstances, or novel enough to offer a fundamentally different experience. Sekiro also does not have magic, like Bloodborne. Instead, there are prosthetics and skills. Prosthetics essentially combine the upgradable magic of Souls games with the novel separation of Hunter's tools in Bloodborne. Like in Bloodborne, Sekiro has a limited resource used for special skills that restrict each time until revisiting a sculptor's idol. Each prosthetic uses a different number to balance their special advantage in a fight. There are 10 separate prosthetic bases in Sekiro, with a total of 30 possible upgrades. Unlike many of the upgrades in Souls, though, these upgrades are not merely based around the range or the damage, but fundamentally change the effect of a tool in a strategic situation. By my count, 15 of the 30 upgrades are essentially more effective variants of previous tools or options. The other 15 are situationally effective alternatives that justify themselves as separate uses. Some let you block fire attacks, some let you break through shields, rip off armor, have strategic delays or stun enemies. Almost every major boss fight and many minor ones have built-in special animations and reactions to a specific strategy use of certain prosthetic upgrades, like the spear on the ape, the shuriken on Lady Butterfly, the spear on Shigekichi of the Red Guard, the flame vent on any bosses or enemies with hair, the firecrackers on any animal. Some are weak to poison, some are nearly immune. All of these have their different uses for people pursuing truly diverse playstyles. The other thing that makes this special is you don't just have to select a couple of these. Instead, they are wildly changeable from the menu, assuming that you have them upgraded and unlocked. Sekiro also contains 3 soft magic skills that unlock with progress, the ninjutsu. All 3 serve dramatically different purposes. One lets you possess unsuspecting enemies upon death blow to fight for you, which can be used strategically in some boss fights. The bestowal ninjutsu lets you temporarily expand the range of your sword after a successful death blow, allowing fights with larger crowds much easier. And the blood smoke ninjutsu lets you create a cloud of blood to escape situations upon death blow. However, even then, if you use blood smoke on poison enemies, it emits a poison cloud that poisons other enemies, and on a select type of lizard, it actually emits a temporary HP recovery effect in those in the smoke. There is deep situational nuance to all of these individual skills, and each of them can be interchanged once unlocked from the menu freely, assuming that you have the spirit emblems left to use them. The final magic analog is skills. There are 5 skill trees in Sekiro. Let's go through them. There are 13 shinobi arts. 2 are mechanically identical upgrades, 3 are essentially stat upgrades, coming out to 8 unique techniques. 5 of these integrate into regular nuance of combat flow and can be performed without equipment, emblem, or any other such cost. They are permanent upgrades to the total skill pool and moves casually available in a fight. The remaining 3 are equipable, mechanically unique skills. In other words, entirely fresh animations for attacks. There are 7 Ashina arts. 1 is a mechanically similar upgrade. 3 are essentially stat upgrades. 1 is a non-equipped skill added, and 2 are mechanically unique equipable skills. There are 12 prosthetic arts. 4 are mechanically similar stat upgrades. 6 are non-equipable passive skills that are added to the regular combat cycle, some being combinable with prosthetics, like following up a slash from a prosthetic combining the power of the prosthetic with the sword, like catching your sword on fire temporarily. The remaining 2 skills are equipable unique skills. There are 7 temple arts. 3 are passive stat upgrades, and 4 are mechanically unique skills, although I'll admit they mostly serve as upgrades on each other for this time. Finally, the 5th skill tree, there are 3 Mushin arts, ultimate skills that are unlockable by combining ultimate arts of other skill trees. These are likely not to be used on a fresh game run without grinding. Even though technically available, they will not be likely useful unless you grind until New Game Plus. Still, 1 is an upgrade of range, and 2 are mechanically distinct. There is, of course, finally, 1 skill detached from any skill tree as well, the Mortal Draw, which comes as the story goes on. All of these, upon unlocking, are freely interchangeable for the player. The amount of combat variety and strategic opportunity for a player in Sekiro, whether they be fresh animations, status effects, combos, environmental effects, or special skills, on any metric, the raw roster in a single run of Sekiro gives many times more options for strategy to players in a fight. If you want variety and strategy in approaching a fight, you won't find yourself with more options than in Sekiro, but it maintains the balance of Bloodborne and the sense of progression with the Soul's magic systems. So, show the game some respect before dismissing it out of hat just because you can't change how your weapon looks, or falling into that embarrassing idea that Sekiro somehow offers less variety. When it comes to gameplay, it not only offers the most options, but also grants the perfect balance. Like I said, I love FromSoft games, and a lot of this stuff I feel like goes under-talked about. When it comes to balance, there's a ton of different things to consider, of course, but I hope that this has somewhat offered a new perspective on some of these different topics, coming from someone who really appreciates Sekiro and often sees it discounted without even considering all of the positives that it very obviously offers. Another thing, hey, it's been a while! The last main video here was the Persona 4 analysis. You might notice I look a little bit different. Well, I've been losing weight, continuing to lose weight, working super hard on my main channel, but I do have content coming for this channel, so I really hope that you'll look out for it. I have a big Steven Universe video that I was working on. I'd love to do more FromSoft content, so please like, comment, do whatever to help me get this video successful, if you want more. And, yeah, I do everything on my own. I am financially desperate. I need your love. So, if you have any spare coins and you want me to succeed a little better, then I'd really appreciate any support on Patreon. Although I guess in regards to FromSoft analysis videos, this is actually not that long, but I'll be back soon. Hope you enjoyed. Take care of yourselves.